"The patient will be dead in 3 minutes," I said. And I remember being absolutely certain of it, because nothing in 32 cycles of medical service had ever been this clear, this mathematically inevitable, this biologically final. And yet the human lying on my examination platform didn't look like someone with 3 minutes left to exist. His name was Ethan Cole, species designation human, origin world Earth, classified as a level 9 death world. And at the time, I still believed that. Classification was exaggerated for bureaucratic drama, a clerical inflation meant to justify higher research funding, because the creature in front of me looked ordinary, barely over 6 feet tall, lean frame, oxygen breathing, soft tissue dominant. No natural armor, no visible defensive adaptations beyond a skeletal structure that should not have supported even half the trauma recorded in his intake file. The file itself was the kind that made even seasoned medics pause, a cascading list of system failures that, in any other species I had ever treated, would have triggered immediate end-of-life protocols. And yet here, he was conscious, alert, eyes tracking movement with a clarity that suggested not distress, but curiosity. I activated the diagnostic overlay again, certain the system had misread something, because the readings made no sense in a universe governed by consistent biological laws. And yet, every scan returned the same conclusion. Every metric aligned with the same outcome. Every predictive model converged on the same endpoint. 3 minutes maximum. Around me, my team moved with controlled urgency, recalibrating instruments, verifying atmospheric balance, adjusting support fields, all the standard procedures when facing catastrophic multi-system trauma. But there was an undercurrent in the room, a subtle tension that came not from panic, but from confusion, because the patient wasn't behaving correctly. He wasn't displaying the expected signs. No elevated distress markers. No erratic movement. No vocalization indicating pain or fear, just steady breathing and a slight tilt of his head, as if he were observing us rather than relying on us. "Doctor," one of my assistants signaled through the internal channel, "should we initiate full stabilization?" And I almost answered automatically, almost followed protocol without question, but something stopped me. Something about the way the human's eyes focused on the overhead display, the way his fingers flexed once against the platform as if testing his own mobility rather than succumbing to failure. I stepped closer, bringing myself within direct visual range. And that was when he looked at me, not with desperation, not with the dull haze of someone slipping toward unconsciousness, but with a calm, measured awareness that did not belong a patient with seconds ticking away. "How bad is it?" he asked, voice steady, accent matching the Earth linguistic profile in our database. And for a moment I did not respond, because the question itself was wrong, not in wording, but in tone. Because beings facing imminent termination do not ask for evaluation with that level of composure. I forced myself to answer, defaulting to honesty, because there was no point in concealment at this stage. "Your condition is critical," I said, choosing a term that would translate across species. "You have sustained damage that would incapacitate most known life forms." And I expected some reaction, some shift in expression, some indication that the reality had registered. But instead, he exhaled slowly, almost like someone acknowledging an inconvenience rather than a terminal state. Behind me, the countdown projection updated again, the algorithm refining its prediction based on real-time data, and the number did not increase. It did not stabilize. It simply continued its descent, confirming what every model had already determined. 3 minutes had become 2 minutes and 41 seconds, and still the human did not change, did not deteriorate in the way he was supposed to, did not align with the outcome that every piece of medical knowledge I possessed insisted was unavoidable. And for the first time in my entire career, I felt something I had not experienced since my earliest training cycle. Not fear exactly, but the quiet, unsettling realization that the rules I trusted might not apply to the organism lying in front of me. The timer dropped to 2 minutes and 12 seconds, and I recalibrated it again, because the number was beginning to feel less like a prediction and more like a challenge to everything I understood about biology. I expanded the diagnostic field, layering in deeper scans, cross-referencing neural activity, circulatory stability, cellular cohesion, every measurable function that defined life as we knew it. And the results only became more contradictory the longer I looked at them. Doctor, his vitals are not declining, my assistant said, her voice controlled but strained in a way that suggested she was already aware of the implications, and I did not respond immediately because I was watching the human instead, watching Ethan Cole shift slightly on the platform, as if adjusting for comfort, not survival, his breathing steady at a rate that would be considered normal for a resting individual, his gaze moving from one piece of equipment to another with quiet interest. I moved closer, again, narrowing my focus to direct observation because the machines were no longer providing clarity, and I asked, "Are you experiencing discomfort?" Knowing the question was inadequate for the situation, but needing some form of baseline. And he considered it for a moment, actually considered it as if evaluating a minor inconvenience. Before answering, "I have had worse," which was not a denial of pain, not even a dismissal, but a comparison that immediately introduced a new variable into the equation, a past reference point that exceeded the current condition. Behind me, the system chimed again, not an alarm, but a recalculation, and I turned just enough to see the projection update, 2 minutes and 12 seconds becoming 2 minutes and 9 seconds, then 2 minutes and 8 seconds, the countdown continuing with mechanical certainty while the patient refused to align with its outcome. "Run a full historical scan," I ordered, my voice sharper than intended, and my team complied. Instantly, pulling data from the human's medical records, environmental exposure logs, anything that could explain the discrepancy, and what returned was not an explanation, but a pattern, a series of incidents flagged as high risk, conditions that would have incapacitated or terminated most species, yet each entry ended the same way. Recovery, continuation, no long-term degradation. I felt something shift internally then, not panic, not yet, but the beginning of a realization that the framework I was using might be incomplete. "Doctor," another assistant signaled, "the predictive model is unstable," and I turned fully to the display this time, watching as the algorithm attempted to reconcile incoming data with expected outcomes, the projection flickering, adjusting, resisting its own conclusion. And for a fraction of a second, the timer hesitated, not stopping, but faltering, as if even the system recognized the inconsistency. I looked back at Ethan, and he was watching me now, not the equipment, not the room, but me, his expression neutral but attentive, as if he understood more about this moment than I did. "You keep looking at that number," he said, nodding slightly toward the projection. "It is not going to help." And the statement was so calm, so certain, that it carried a weight my training could not categorize. "That number represents your remaining time," I replied, maintaining professional tone out of habit more than conviction. And he gave a small, almost amused exhale, not laughter, not mockery, just acknowledgement. "That is not how it works," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no attempt to challenge authority, just a simple correction, as if I had misidentified something obvious. The room fell into a strange silence after that, not the silence of inaction, but of suspended understanding. Every member of my team continuing their tasks while simultaneously waiting for something none of us could define. The timer continued its descent, now at 1 minute and 47 seconds. But the urgency it was supposed to create had been replaced by something else entirely, a growing sense that we were not approaching an end point, but standing at the edge of phenomenon we did not yet comprehend. And as I watched the human sit there, breathing evenly, eyes steady, body refusing to follow the script written by every known law of medicine, I realized that for the first time, the countdown might not be measuring his survival, but the limits of our own understanding. The timer reached 1 minute and 30 seconds, and that was the point where protocol demanded escalation. Not because the patient was declining, but because the system insisted he should have been, and the longer that contradiction persisted, the more dangerous the situation became for everyone in the room. I initiated a full neural integrity scan, pushing beyond standard limits, overriding safety thresholds that normally protected both patient and equipment because I needed clarity and I was no longer willing to trust surface readings. the display filled with layered data, neural pathways mapped in precise detail, electrical activity translating into patterns that should have shown instability, degradation, something that aligned with the predicted outcome. But instead the signals were stable, not just stable, but efficient, as if the brain was operating under optimal conditions rather than systemic failure. "Doctor, the readings are consistent," my assistant said, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not confusion anymore, but the beginning of concern that extended beyond the patient. I leaned closer to the projection, isolating specific regions, comparing them against baseline models for human physiology, and every comparison returned the same conclusion. There was no collapse, no cascade failure, no sign that the body was approaching termination. And yet the injuries listed in his file had not changed. They were still there, still present, still severe by every measurable standard. I turned back to Ethan, and he was no longer lying flat on the platform. He had shifted upward slightly, supporting himself on one arm in a movement so casual that it took my mind a moment to process what I was seeing. "You should remain still," I said automatically, the words coming from training rather than belief, and he nodded once. Not in compliance, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood the instruction without feeling any need to. "Follow it. You were trying to make sense of it," he said, his voice calm, almost thoughtful, and I did not respond because the statement was accurate in a way that made denial pointless. "Your models," he continued, glancing toward the diagnostic displays, "they're built on assumptions that do not include us," and that word "us" carried more weight than any medical term in my vocabulary, because it implied a category, a classification that existed outside the frameworks we had established. Behind me, the system chimed again, but this time the tone was different, not a countdown marker, but a warning, and I turned to see the projection flicker violently before stabilizing on a new value. 1 minute and 30 seconds becoming 1 minute and 31 seconds, then 1 minute and 32, the number moving in the wrong direction, reversing itself in a way that should have been impossible. "That is not possible," one of my team members said aloud, breaking the controlled silence we had maintained until now, and I could not correct them, because I was watching the same anomaly, the same violation of predictive certainty that was unfolding in real time. The algorithm attempted to compensate, recalculating, adjusting parameters, but each adjustment only pushed the number further from its original trajectory, as if the system itself was being forced to acknowledge new data it could not reconcile. I felt a shift then, not in the room, but in my own perception, a subtle but undeniable change in how I was interpreting everything in front of me, because the assumption that had guided my entire career, that biology followed consistent, predictable rules, was no longer holding. I looked at Ethan again, and he was watching the display now, not with concern, but with a kind of quiet familiarity, as if he had seen this pattern before, as if the reversal of inevitability was not surprising to him. "How much time does it say now?" he asked. And the question was simple, almost casual, but it forced me to answer in a way that felt increasingly uncertain. 1 minute and 34 seconds, I said, and even as I spoke the number changed again, climbing instead of falling, and for the first time I understood that the timer was no longer measuring his survival at all. It was measuring our failure to understand it. The room had gone completely still now, every movement slowed, every action deliberate, because we were no longer treating a patient in critical condition. We were observing a system that refused to behave according to any known law, and as the numbers continued to rise, as the predicted endpoint moved further and further away, I realized that whatever Ethan Cole was, whatever a Deathworld human truly meant, it was not something that could be defined by the limits we had always assumed were absolute. The number climbed past 1 minute and 40 seconds, and that was when I did something I had never done in my entire medical career. I shut the predictive system off completely because it had become worse than useless. It was contaminating the situation with assumptions that no longer applied, and the moment the projection disappeared from the air above us, the room felt different, quieter, not because the machines had stopped, but because the illusion of control had been removed. "Manual. Observation only," I said, and my team hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. because turning off a predictive model mid-case was not just unconventional, it was unthinkable, but none of us were pretending this was a standard case anymore. I turned back to Ethan, focusing entirely on what I could see without interpretation layers. And what I saw did not match the profile of a being in critical condition. His posture had improved, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention in a normal scenario, but enough that the difference was undeniable. His breathing remained steady, his skin tone stable, no visible indicators of systemic distress. And when he shifted again, this time swinging his legs slightly toward the edge of the platform, it was not a struggle, it was a decision. "You should not be able to do that," I said, and I realized as the words left my mouth that I was no longer speaking as a doctor issuing instructions. I was stating an observation that had lost its authority. He glanced at me. Not dismissive, not confrontational, just acknowledging the statement like someone hearing a familiar misconception. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that comes up a lot." And there was a tone in his voice that I could not categorize, something between patience and experience, as if he had explained this before, many times to many different beings who all started from the same flawed premise. I initiated a localized scan, not a full system sweep, just a focused read on tissue response, cellular activity, the smallest measurable units of recovery. And what I saw forced me to pause because the data did not indicate stabilization. It indicated progression, not toward failure, but toward repair. Micro-level adjustments happening in real time, cells maintaining integrity under conditions that should have disrupted them, structures holding alignment where collapse was expected. "Doctor," my assistant said, and this time there was no attempt to mask the uncertainty. Are we looking at regeneration?" And I almost rejected the idea immediately, because regeneration at that scale, at that speed, in that condition, was not supported by any known biological model. But the data was there, consistent, repeatable, undeniable. I looked back at Ethan, and he was watching my reaction now. Not the machines, not the room, just me, as if my understanding of the situation was the most interesting variable in play. "It is not regeneration," he said before I could respond to my assistant. And that immediate correction told me something important. He was not guessing, he was not speculating, he knew. "Then what is it?" I asked, and for the first time since the case began, I was not asking as an authority, I was asking because I needed the answer. He shifted again, moving a little more upright, testing his balance in a way that suggested confidence rather than caution. "It is just normal," he said, and that word, normal, landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because it implied that everything we were witnessing, everything that had disrupted our systems and our expectations, was not exceptional. From his perspective, it was baseline. Behind me, one of the secondary monitors chimed softly, not an alert, just a passive update, and I glanced at out habit, expecting nothing useful, but the data displayed there showed something that made me still completely. Metabolic activity, not declining, not even holding steady, but increasing slightly, energy distribution optimizing, as if the body was reallocating resources to maintain function under stress rather than shutting down. "You are not deteriorating," I said slowly, and again I heard the shift in my own voice. The transition from certainty to observation, from explanation to realization. "No," Ethan replied, and there was no emphasis, no need to reinforce the statement. It was simply a fact to him. The room had changed now in a way that went beyond procedure, beyond protocol. Every member of my team was watching, not working, not intervening, just watching, because we had reached a point where intervention no longer made sense. We were not preventing an outcome. We were witnessing a different one unfold. I took a step back, not physically but mentally, reassessing everything I had categorized at the beginning of this case, the injury report, the predictions, the assumptions about limits, and one by one they stopped holding together, like a structure built on foundations that were never as solid as we believed. "On your world," I said, choosing my words carefully now, "conditions like this, they happen often," and he considered that for a moment, not because the question was difficult, but because he seemed to be deciding how much of the answer we were ready to understand. "More than you would think," he said finally, and that was when I realized that we had not brought a dying patient into this room. We had brought in a reference point, a living example of a biological system that operated under rules we had never studied, never accounted for. And as Ethan Cole sat there, steady, functional, completely out of alignment with everything we had predicted, I understood that the real condition we were dealing with was not his, it was ours, the limits of our knowledge. And those limits were beginning to fail. Define normal, I said, and I did not recognize my own voice when I asked it because it no longer carried authority. It carried something else, something closer to uncertainty. And Ethan noticed that immediately, not reacting to it, just acknowledging it the same way he had acknowledged everything else in this room, with quiet awareness. He shifted again, this time fully sitting on the edge of the platform, feet touching the floor, posture relaxed in a way that would have been unremarkable anywhere else except here. In a medical bay where every system had already concluded he should not be conscious, let alone mobile. Normal for us, he said, and he did. Not rush the explanation, did not try to simplify it for our understanding. Means you keep going until you cannot, and most of the time, you find out you can a lot later than you expected. And there was no pride in that statement, no attempt to impress, just a description, like he was explaining weather patterns or gravity. I activated another scan without thinking, not because I expected a different result, but because my training demanded repetition when faced with anomaly, and the data returned faster this time, almost instantly, as if the system had already adapted to the pattern it was observing. Cellular activity continuing to adjust, not repairing in the way we defined it, not reversing damage in a dramatic or visible way, but maintaining function through it, distributing strain across systems instead of allowing any single point to fail. That is not sustainable, one of my assistants said, and I understood why, because in every model we had ever studied, resilience had limits, thresholds beyond which systems collapsed, and what we were seeing should have crossed those thresholds long ago. It is, Ethan replied before I could respond. And again, there was no hesitation, no need to consider the answer. You are looking for a point where everything stops working at once. That is not how it goes for us. And I felt that shift again, that internal recalibration where my expectations were being replaced one piece at a time. Then how does it go? I asked, and I was aware now that I was no longer leading this interaction. I was following it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, a posture that suggested conversation rather than treatment. Systems slow down, others pick up the slack, you compensate, adjust, keep moving, he said, and each word aligned with the data I was seeing in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. It is not about avoiding damage, it is about functioning through it, and that concept, functioning through damage, was fundamentally incompatible with the way we had built our entire medical framework, which focused on prevention, stabilization, restoration. Behind me, one of the secondary systems began to log the data automatically, not because we instructed it to, but because it had detected a pattern worth recording, and I realized that what we were witnessing was no longer just a case, it was a data set, a baseline for something we had never properly studied. I stepped closer again, not to intervene, but to observe more directly, and I could see subtle signs now that I had missed before, not signs of decline, but signs of adaptation, micro-adjustments in posture, controlled breathing, small shifts in balance that redistributed strain in ways that preserved overall function. You were compensating, I said, and this time was not a question, it was a realization. He replied, as if that should have been obvious from the beginning. Everyone does, we just do it longer, and that word longer carried implications that extended far beyond this room, beyond this case, into a broader understanding of what a Deathworld species actually meant. I glanced at the monitors again, and the numbers had stabilized, not because the system had found a solution, but because it had stopped trying to force one. The predictive model offline, the raw data continuing to update in real time without interpretation. And for the first time since this began, the absence of prediction felt more accurate than any calculation we had made. On your world, I said slowly, choosing each word with care now. This level of resilience, it is common? And he tilted his head slightly, considering the question in a way that suggested he was translating it into his own frame of reference. Depends on where you are, he said, and that answer was not as simple as it sounded, because it implied variability. Environments where even this level of endurance might not be enough. But yeah, most people would not stop for something like this, and I felt the full weight of that statement settle over the room. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet shift in perspective that none of us could ignore. I looked around at my team, at the instruments, at the data that no longer fit into any category we understood, and then back at Ethan Cole, sitting there, steady, composed, not recovering in the way we defined recovery, but continuing in a way we had never considered possible. And I realized that the most dangerous assumption we had made was not that he would die. It was that we understood what it meant for him to be alive. So what happens if you stop? I asked, and that question came out quieter than the others. Not because it was less important, but because I was beginning to understand that the answers I would receive were not going to fit into anything I had been trained to expect. Ethan did not answer immediately, and for the first time since he had entered this room, he looked away from me, not toward the machines, not toward the exits, but somewhere unfocused, as if the question had triggered a memory rather than calculation. You do. Not, he said finally, and the simplicity of the answer made it more unsettling than anything else he had told us, because it was not a deflection, it was a direct statement that contradicted the fundamental assumption behind every biological system we had studied, that there was always a point where continuation was no longer possible. That is not sustainable, my assistant repeated. But this time the words lacked conviction, because even as she said them, the evidence in front of us continued to disagree. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance in a way that redistributed pressure across his frame, a movement so subtle it would have gone unnoticed earlier, but now every adjustment carried meaning, every small change reinforcing the pattern we were beginning to recognize. You are still thinking in terms of limits, he said, and again there was no condescension in his tone, just a calm correction. Limits exist. Sure, but they're not where you think they are, and I felt that internal recalibration again, that slow erosion of certainty that had defined my entire professional identity. I turned back to the data feeds, watching the live metrics update without the interference of predictive models, and what I saw was not a system approaching failure, but one maintaining equilibrium under strain, dynamic adjustments occurring continuously, small variations compensating for larger ones, a constant balancing act that never settled into stability, but also never collapsed. You are not stabilizing, I said, and this time I understood the distinction clearly. You are maintaining, and Ethan nodded once, confirming the observation as if it were obvious. That is the idea, he said, and there was something in that phrase that suggested intention, design, not conscious in the moment, but embedded in the way his species functioned. Behind me, one of the junior medics stepped closer to the central console. Hesitating before speaking, "Doctor, the system is requesting to reactivate predictive modeling with updated parameters." And I almost agreed, almost returned to the comfort of structured analysis. But I stopped myself because I knew now that the models would not adapt fast enough. They would only attempt to force this phenomenon into existing frameworks. Denied, I said, and the word felt final in a way that went beyond the system request, because it marked a shift in how we were approaching this entire situation. I looked back at Ethan, and he was watching the room again, taking in the reactions, the adjustments, the subtle change in how we were positioning ourselves around him, no longer as caregivers managing a critical patient, but as observers trying to understand something we had never encountered before. On your world, I said, and I was aware now that every question I asked was building toward something larger. How do you train for this? Because it could not be random. It could not be purely reactive. There had to be a process, a pattern that produced this level of resilience. He gave a small exhale, something close to a quiet laugh, but without humor, more like recognition. You do not train for this specifically, he said. You just grow up with it. And that answer was more revealing than any detailed explanation could have been, because it meant this was not specialized, not rare, not the result of elite conditioning. It was baseline, an environmental adaptation so ingrained that it did not require conscious development. I felt a shift ripple through the room at that. Not visible, not audible, but present in the way my team processed the information, because if this was baseline, then everything we had assumed about human fragility was fundamentally incorrect. I gestured slightly toward him, toward the data, toward the entire situation unfolding in front of us. This is normal. And I realized as I said it that I was no longer questioning him. I was testing my own understanding. Yeah, Ethan said, and this time there was a hint of finality in the response. Not dismissive, but conclusive, pretty much, and that was when I understood that we had reached a point where the question was no longer whether he would survive. That had already been answered. The question was how many other assumptions we had made about his species that were just as wrong. And as I stood there, watching a being who had completely invalidated every predictive model we relied on simply by continuing to function, I realized that we were not witnessing an exception. We were witnessing a standard we had never been prepared to measure. Then why bring you here? I asked. And that question did not come from protocol or curiosity alone. It came from a growing inconsistency that I could no longer ignore, because if everything we were seeing was normal for a species, then this entire situation, this emergency intake, this classification of critical condition, it did not align with his reality at all. Ethan looked at me for a moment, and this time there was a subtle shift in his expression. Not discomfort, not concern, but something closer to consideration, as if he was deciding how much context we actually lacked. Because from your perspective, he said, it looks bad, and that answer was so simple that it almost felt dismissive. Except it was not wrong. It was perfectly accurate. We had reacted based on our models, our thresholds, our definitions of failure, and in doing so we had created a scenario that, to him, did not carry the same urgency. I turned slightly, looking at the intake report again, the initial assessment that had triggered this entire response, and I saw it differently now. Not as an objective measurement of his condition, but as an interpretation filtered through assumptions that no longer held. You requested medical assistance, I said, needing to anchor the situation in something concrete. And he nodded once, acknowledging the point. Yeah, he said, I did, and there was no contradiction there, no attempt to deny the action, which meant there was a distinction I was still missing. Then why? I asked, and this time the question carried more weight because it was not about his condition, it was about his decision. He shifted slightly again, rolling one shoulder in a control motion that would have triggered concern earlier, but now simply registered as another adjustment, another example of how his body managed itself. Because it is easier, he said, and that answer introduced an entirely new variable into the equation, one that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with efficiency. Easier, I repeated, and I was aware that I was no longer interpreting his words through a medical lens alone. I was trying to understand a behavioral framework that operated alongside the biological one. Yeah, he said, you fix what you can, you let the rest sort itself out. And that phrase, let the rest sort itself out, carried implications that extended far beyond this room, because it suggested a level of trust in the body's ability to manage itself that we did not account for in our models. Behind me, one of the monitors updated again, passively tracking his condition, and I saw something that made me pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Small indicators of strain were decreasing incrementally, not in a linear recovery pattern, but in a gradual redistribution that reduced overall load without eliminating it entirely. You are improving, I said, and this time the statement felt different, not like a milestone, but like a continuation of the same process we had been observing. I am adjusting, Ethan corrected, and again the distinction mattered, because improvement implied a return to a previous state, while adjustment implied ongoing change without a fixed endpoint. I glanced around the room, at my team, at the systems that were now operating in observation mode rather than intervention, and I realized that our role had shifted completely. We were no longer treating, we were documenting. So you came here, I said slowly, aligning the pieces as they began to form a coherent picture. Not because you were failing, but because it was inefficient not to. And he gave a small nod, confirming the interpretation. Pretty much, he said. And there was that same calm certainty in his voice, the same absence of urgency that had been present from the beginning. I felt the final layer of misunderstanding settle into place then, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet conclusion that had been building since the moment he arrived. Because everything we had done, every decision, every assumption had been based on a misalignment of definitions. We saw a system approaching failure. He saw a system operating within normal parameters. On your world, I said, and this time the question was not about biology or resilience. It was about perspective. How often do you rely on external help? And he considered that for a moment, not because the answer was complex, but because he seemed to be translating it into something that made sense within his own context. When it saves time, he said finally, and that answer completed the picture in a way nothing else could, because it reduced everything we had witnessed, everything that had challenged our understanding, to a simple principle: efficiency. I looked at him then, really looked, not as a patient, not as an anomaly, but as a representative of a system that operated under a completely different set of priorities, and I realized that the most significant difference between us was not strength, not endurance, not even biology. It was expectation. We expected systems to fail and required intervention to prevent it. He expected systems to continue and only sought intervention when it was convenient. And as that understanding settled in, I knew that what we had witnessed here was not an exception. It was a baseline we had never been prepared to recognize. So from your perspective, I said slowly, feeling the words settle into place as I spoke them, there was never a moment where this was critical, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, not disagreeing, not correcting, just acknowledging the framing of the question. Not really, he said, and there was no hesitation in the answer, no attempt to soften it. Just a simple confirmation that everything we had classified as urgent had never reached that threshold for him. I turned back to the monitors. Again, not because I expected new information, but because I needed to see the data one more time through this new lens, and what had once looked like a cascade toward failure now appeared as a system in motion, dynamic, responsive, constantly redistributing load without collapsing under it. Doctor, one of my assistants said quietly, his metabolic output is normalizing. And that word, normalizing, carried a different meaning now. Not a return from danger, but a continuation of the same process we had been observing, gradual adjustment without interruption. I nodded once, not as a command, but as acknowledgement, and stepped closer to Ethan again, watching as he rolled his shoulders once more, a controlled movement that would have triggered immediate intervention earlier, but now simply registered as part of his ongoing adaptation. You are preparing to leave, I said, and it was not a question. It was an observation drawn from the way he had shifted his weight, the way his posture had aligned toward movement rather than rest. Yeah, he replied, just as calmly as before. Unless you have something else you want to check, and that offer, casual and unpressured, underscored everything we had misunderstood, because from his perspective, this interaction had already served its purpose. I hesitated for a moment, not because I lacked procedures to follow, but because the procedures themselves no longer felt relevant. We had no protocol for a patient who did not need to be saved, only observed. One more scan, I said finally, not out of necessity, but out of a need to confirm what we had learned. And he nodded again, allowing it without resistance, without impatience. I initiated the scan manually this time, bypassing all automated interpretations, focusing only on raw data, and as the results streamed in, they confirmed what we had already seen: no systemic collapse, no critical thresholds being crossed, just a body maintaining function through conditions that would have overwhelmed any other species in our database. It is consistent, my assistant said. And this time there was no confusion in her voice, only acceptance. I deactivated the scanner and stepped back, giving Ethan space not because he needed it, but because it felt appropriate, because the dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer the subject of our control. He was the reference point we had been trying to understand. He stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth transition from sitting to standing, his balance steady, his movements controlled, and the simplicity of that action carried more impact than any data we had collected, because it demonstrated in the most direct way possible that everything we had predicted had been wrong. No one moved to stop him. No one issued a command, because there was nothing left to prevent. You are cleared, I said, and the words felt different than any clearance I'd given before. not a release from danger, but an acknowledgement that there had never been danger in the way we defined it. He gave a small nod, accepting the statement without ceremony, and took a step toward the exit, pausing only briefly as if considering something. "You might want to update your models," he said, and there was no criticism in the suggestion, just a simple observation, like pointing out a tool that needed recalibration. I did not respond immediately, because the statement carried implications that extended far beyond this room, beyond this case, into every assumption we had built about human physiology and its limits. He continued toward the exit then, each step measured, controlled, completely unremarkable in any other context. And yet in this room, in this moment, it represented the collapse of an entire framework. The door opened, and he passed through it without looking back, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but full, filled with data, with questions, with a new baseline we had not been prepared to recognize. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the space he had occupied, then turned, slowly back to the monitors, to the systems that now seemed incomplete in a way they had never seemed before. "Archive everything," I said, and my team moved immediately, not because they were told to, but because they understood the significance of what we had witnessed. As the data began to compile, as the room returned to its normal operational state, I realized that nothing about this was normal anymore, because we had not just observed a patient who survived conditions that should have ended him. We had observed a system that redefined what survival meant. And as I looked at the final readings one last time, I understood that the most important change would not be in our equipment or our procedures. It would be in our expectations, because from this point forward, we could no longer assume that human limits aligned with our own. The door closed behind him with a soft seal, and for a few seconds no one in the room moved, not because we were unsure what to do next, but because we were all processing the same realization at different speeds, that nothing in our training had prepared us for what we had just witnessed. I turned slowly back toward the central console, the data still streaming across the display, and for the first time I saw it without expectation, without trying to force it into a familiar pattern, just raw information describing a system that had never actually been in danger. "Run a full comparative analysis," I said, and this time my voice carried a different tone, not urgency, not authority, but intent, because this was no longer about treating a patient, it was about understanding a baseline. My team moved immediately, pulling up archive cases, cross-referencing species data, overlaying Ethan Cole's readings against every known biological model we had on record, and the result was immediate and absolute. There was no match, not even a partial alignment. Every comparison failed to produce a meaningful correlation. "Doctor," one of the senior analysts said, "the deviation is total," and that statement, delivered without hesitation, confirmed what we were already beginning to understand, that this was not an outlier within known parameters. It was a completely separate framework. I stepped closer to the display, isolating specific metrics, looking for anything that resembled a threshold, a limit, a point where the system would indicate failure under strain. But every time I approached that conclusion, the data shifted, compensating, redistributing, maintaining function in ways that defied linear prediction. "Archive this under a new classification," I said, and the words felt heavier than any directive I had issued before, because classification was not just organization, it was definition, and we were about to define something we did not fully understand. "What designation?" my assistant asked, and for a moment I did not answer, because the existing categories no longer applied. Fragile, resilient, high risk, none of them captured what we had observed. "Adaptive continuity," I said finally, and the phrase formed as I spoke it, not from existing terminology, but from the pattern itself, a system that did not avoid failure, but moved through it without stopping. The room remained quiet as the new classification was logged, not because there was nothing to say, but because every one of us understood that this single entry would change how we interpreted every future human case. I replayed the initial intake data, then, watching it from the beginning, the moment Ethan had arrived, the assessments we had made, the conclusions we had drawn, and I could see now exactly where we had gone wrong, not in the measurements themselves, but in the assumptions behind them. We had interpreted resilience as resistance. when in reality it was continuity, a constant state of adjustment rather than a binary state of stability. Or failure. Doctor, another voice call from the secondary station. External sensors are still tracking the subject, and I turned toward the auxiliary display, watching as Ethan's biometrics continued to update even outside our direct observation. His movement steady, his systems maintaining the same pattern we had seen inside. No sudden changes, no delayed collapse, just continuation. Increase monitoring resolution, I said, not because I expected something to happen, but because I needed to confirm that this was not limited to a controlled environment, and the data returned consistent. The same adaptive patterns persisting beyond the medical bay, beyond our influence entirely. I felt a subtle shift in the room then, not in the data, but in the way my team processed it, because the implication was no longer theoretical. It was confirmed. This was not a temporary state. It was standard operation. I stepped back from the console, looking around at the equipment, at the systems that had defined our understanding of biology for so long, and I realized that they were not wrong. They were incomplete, built on a dataset that had never included a species like this. Update all human-related protocols, I said, and this time there was no hesitation from anyone in the room, because we all understood that the old thresholds, the old triggers for intervention, they no longer applied. As the commands were executed, as the system began to integrate the new classification, I looked once more at the external feed, at the figure of Ethan Cole moving through the station as if nothing had happened. And I understood that from his perspective, there had been no crisis, no recovery, no moment of survival, just a minor inefficiency that had been addressed and then left behind. And as that understanding settled in, I realized that the most significant change would not be in how we treated humans, but in how we perceived them. Because we had spent cycles, believing they were fragile systems that occasionally exceeded expectations, when in reality, they were continuous systems that only appeared fragile because we were measuring them with the wrong standards. Flag all. Incoming human cases for observational priority, I said, and the instruction moved through the system faster than I expected, cascading across departments, updating protocols in real time. Not as an emergency measure, but as a recalibration of focus, because what we had just documented was no longer an isolated incident. It was a precedent. The central display shifted as the classification integrated, adaptive continuity appearing as a new reference layer across all human-related data, and I watched as older cases began to reprocess automatically, outcomes that had once been labeled as anomalies now aligning under a consistent pattern. Doctor, my senior analyst said, previous human records are updating, and I moved closer, watching as archive files recalculated their conclusions. Incidents we had previously categorized as unexpected recoveries now redefined as expected continuations, the language changing, the interpretation shifting, the entire dataset reorganizing itself. Around a principle we had only just recognized. I felt a quiet tension in the room. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the weight of realization, because this was not just about one patient, it was about every human we had ever treated, every assumption we had made, every conclusion we had drawn. I accessed one of the older cases, a human who had been admitted cycles ago under similar conditions, and I saw it clearly now, the same pattern, the same misinterpretation. We had intervened aggressively, expecting collapse, when in reality the system had never been close to failing, and our actions, while well-intentioned, had been based on incorrect thresholds. We have been overcorrecting, I said, and the statement settled over the room with a quiet finality, because it was not a criticism of our methods. It was an acknowledgement of their limitations. Adjust intervention protocols, I continued. Reduce escalation triggers for human physiology. And this time, there was a slight pause before. The command executed, not because my team doubted the instruction, but because they understood the implications. We were not just updating procedures. We were redefining what constituted a medical emergency. For an entire species, the system responded, integrating the changes, recalibrating alert thresholds, and I watched as the new parameters took effect, creating a gap between human data and every other species in our records. Not a small difference, but a fundamental separation. I turned back to the external feed again, where Ethan Cole's biometrics continued to update as he moved through the station. And I noticed something I had not focused on before, not just the stability of his systems, but the efficiency of his movement. The way each step aligned with the adaptive pattern we had observed, small adjustments maintaining balance, conserving energy, optimizing function without conscious effort. He is not just enduring, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else. He is optimizing, and that distinction mattered because endurance implied resistance, while optimization implied design. Doctor, my assistant said, do we notify central research? And I considered the question. For a moment, not because the answer was unclear, but because of the scale of what we were about to communicate. This was not a minor update, not a routine report. This was a shift in understanding that would affect every field that interacted with human biology. Yes, I said finally, full report include raw data, no interpretation filters. And that last part was critical, because any attempt to frame this within existing models would distort it. We needed them to see exactly what we had seen, without assumptions, without translation. As the transmission began, I took one last look at the compiled data, at the new classification, at the updated protocols, and I realized that this was only the beginning, because understanding a system required more than observation. It required adaptation, and we had just taken the first step. I stepped back from the console, the room now fully active again. My team moving with purpose, not to respond to a crisis, but to integrate a new reality into our work. And as I watched the process unfold, I understood that the most significant change would not be immediate. It would come over time, as more data aligned, as more cases confirmed the pattern, as the idea of human fragility was replaced by something far more complex. I looked once more at the external feed, at the figure of Ethan Cole disappearing into the distance. And I knew that we had not just updated our understanding of one species, we had challenged the foundation of how we defined limits themselves. Because if a system could continue under conditions that should have ended it, then those conditions were not limits. They were thresholds we had misunderstood. And as that realization settled in, I knew that everything we did from this point forward would have to account for a possibility we had never considered before, that survival was not a state to be preserved, but a process that could extend far beyond what we had ever imagined. The confirmation from central research did not come immediately, and that in itself was unusual because high-priority medical transmissions were typically acknowledged within seconds. But this time the system remained silent for longer than expected, processing, verifying, recalibrating, and when the response finally arrived, it was not a simple acknowledgement. It was a request for continuous live feed access to all human-related data streams. They are opening a full review channel, my assistant said, her voice steady, but carrying the same underlying realization we were all experiencing, that this was no longer a local update. It was a systemic shift. I authorized the connection without hesitation, and the central interface expanded across our primary display, new observers joining in real time, analysts, researchers, specialists from multiple fields, all focusing on the same dataset we had just begun to understand. Medical Bay 7, this is Central Research Division. A voice came through the channel, formal but controlled. We have received your classification update, confirmed designation adaptive continuity, and I nodded even though they could not see the gesture. Confirmed, I said, based on direct observation and verified data, human physiology operates under a continuous adaptive model rather than threshold-based stability. And there was a brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation, but recalculation, as if they were aligning this new information with their own frameworks. We are cross-referencing your data with long-term human interaction records, the voice replied. Initial results indicate alignment with previously unclassified anomalies. And that statement reinforced what we had already begun to suspect, that this pattern had always been present, just never properly recognized. I pulled up the external tracking feed again, expanding it across the shared channel, allowing Central to observe Ethan Cole's ongoing movement through the station, his biometrics updating in real time, steady, efficient, unchanged in any way that suggested delayed failure. Subject remains fully functional, I reported, No signs of systemic degradation, no delayed collapse indicators. And as I spoke, I realized that I was no longer describing a recovery. I was describing a baseline condition. Increased temporal scope, Central responded. We want extended monitoring, minimum, of 12 standard hours. And that request made sense because if this pattern held over time, it would confirm that what we had seen was not situational, it was constant. Understood, I said, and initiated the extended tracking protocol, linking multiple sensor arrays to maintain continuous observation without interference. As the system adjusted, I felt that shift again, the one that had been building since the beginning of this case. But now it was clearer, more defined. We were no longer reacting to an anomaly. We were documenting a rule. Doctor, one of my team members said quietly, if this applies to all humans, and she did not finish the sentence because she did not need to. The implication was already clear. Every human we had ever categorized as fragile. Every protocol we had designed to protect them based on that assumption. It all required reevaluation. It does, I said, not as a guess, not as a theory, but as a conclusion supported by the data we were now reviewing. Because the archived records, the live observation, the direct interaction, they all pointed to the same pattern. The central display updated again, integrating external research findings into our feed, and I saw confirmation markers begin to appear, not from one source, but from multiple independent datasets, each one aligning with the same principle. Adaptive continuity was not a localized phenomenon. It was species-wide. Medical Bay 7, Central said, and this time there was a subtle shift in their tone, less formal, more focused. Your classification is being provisionally accepted for system-wide integration. And that statement carried more weight than any directive we had issued locally. Because it meant this understanding was no longer confined to this room. It was becoming part of the larger framework. I looked around the bay at my team, at the systems that had already begun to adapt, and I realized that we were witnessing the moment where a misconception transitioned into a new standard. Continue monitoring, Central added. We will be issuing updated guidelines shortly. And the channel remained open, the connection persistent, because this was not a completed case. It was an ongoing study. I turned back to the external feed once more, watching as Ethan Cole continued through the station, unchanged, unimpeded, operating exactly as he had before he ever entered this room. And I understood that from his perspective, nothing significant had occurred, while from ours, everything had changed. And as that contrast settled into place, I realized that the most important adjustment we would have to make was not in our systems or our procedures, but in our expectations. Because we had spent cycles defining human limits based on observations that we now knew were incomplete, and from this point forward, every interaction, every assessment, every conclusion would have to account for a reality we had only just begun to understand. That human survival was not a boundary to be protected. It was a process that did not end where we thought it did. Central did not close the channel, and that alone told me everything about the weight of what we had uncovered, because normally once a case transitioned from emergency to observation, oversight reduced, protocols resumed their usual flow, but this time the connection remained open, active, watching, as if the entire system was waiting for something else to happen. I continued monitoring the external feed, and Ethan Cole's biometrics remained consistent. Not static, never static, but constantly adjusting within a narrow and controlled range. His movement through the station smooth, efficient, without hesitation, without any indication that his body was approaching a limit. 12-minute interval check complete. My assistant reported. No deviation. And that phrase, no deviation, carried more significance than any anomaly we had recorded earlier, because it confirmed continuity over time, not just in a controlled environment, but in normal activity. I expanded the feed further, pulling environmental data into the analysis, temperature shifts, atmosphere variation, minor gravitational fluctuations across different sectors of the station, and with each new variable, the pattern held, not disrupted, not strained, simply integrated into his ongoing adaptation. Is not just maintaining, I said more, to the room than to Central. He is integrating variables in real time, And I saw the data confirm it as I spoke. Small adjustments in respiration, micro changes in muscle tension, subtle shifts in energy distribution, all happening continuously, all without conscious delay. Central confirms, the voice responded, cross-analysis indicates multi-system adaptation without threshold trigger. And there is something different in their tone now, not just acknowledgement, but a level of focus that bordered on caution, because this was no longer just a biological curiosity. It was a system that operated beyond predictable constraints. I accessed a broader data set then, not just medical records, but environmental studies from Earth itself, the origin point of the species. And as the data populated the display, the context became clearer in a way that was both logical and unsettling. Fluctuating conditions, variable pressures, constant environmental challenges that would push most biological systems toward failure. And yet for humans, these conditions were baseline, not exceptions. Doctor, one of my team said quietly, their world does not stabilize, and that observation aligned perfectly with what we were seeing, because if the environment itself was in constant flux, then any species that evolved within it would not rely on stability. It would rely on continuous adaptation. I looked back at Ethan's data again, and for the first time, I was not comparing it to other species, I was comparing it to the environment he came from, and suddenly the pattern made sense, not as an anomaly, but as a requirement, a system designed to function without fixed limits because the conditions it evolved in did not allow for them. Adaptive continuity is not a trait, I said slowly. It is a survival model, and the distinction matters because a trait could be isolated, measured, categorized, but a model defined the entire system. Every function, every response, every expectation. Central acknowledges, the voice replied, and I could hear the shift in their processing, the transition from classification to understanding, recommending expansion of study parameters beyond medical scope. And that recommendation confirmed what I was already realizing. This was not just about treatment. It was about redefining how we approach human interaction across all fields. I returned my focus to the live feed once more, and Ethan had slowed slightly, not from fatigue, not from strain, but to interact with another individual in the corridor. His posture relaxed, his movements controlled. No indication that anything we had observed earlier was still affecting him in a way that limited function. No behavioral deviation, my assistant added. And again, that phrase carried weight, because it meant that even under previously classified critical conditions, his behavior remained within normal parameters for his species. I stepped back from the console, letting the data continue to flow, and I realized that we had reached a point where additional observation would not change the conclusion. It would only reinforce it. Central, I said, we are no longer observing recovery. We are observing standard operation under variable conditions. And there was a brief pause before the response came. Not because they disagreed, but because they were aligning that statement with everything else they had received. Confirmed, they said finally, updating global framework accordingly. And with that, the shift was complete, not just in this room, not just in the station, but across every system connected to central research. I looked around the medical bay one last time, at the equipment at my team, at the data that had redefined our understanding in less than a standard hour, and I understood that what we had witnessed was not a rare event. It was a fundamental truth that had gone unrecognized for too long. And as the live feed continued to track Ethan Cole moving through the station, unchanged, unaffected, operating exactly as he always had, I realized that the most profound implication of all was not that humans could survive conditions that would cripple other species. It was that for them, those conditions were never the end point to begin with. They were simply part of the process of continuing. It took exactly 37 minutes for Central to issue the first system-wide update. And when it came through, it did not arrive as a recommendation or a suggestion. It arrived as a directive, integrated across every connected medical system. Every protocol, every diagnostic framework that interacted with human physiology. I watched the update propagate in real time, new parameters overriding old ones, thresholds recalibrated, alert triggers redefined, entire branches of automated response. Logic rewritten to account for a model that no longer assumed failure as the default outcome. Global framework updated. my assistant confirmed, and there was something in her voice that had changed, not uncertainty anymore, not even curiosity, but a quiet recognition that we were now operating under a different set of rules. I turned back to the external feed one final time, and Ethan Cole was no longer within primary sensor range, his signal fading as he moved deeper into the stations. Transit network, his biometrics still steady, still consistent, still reflecting the same continuous adaptation we had observed from the beginning. Tracking lost, another voice reported, and for a moment the screen held the last recorded data point. A perfect snapshot of a system in motion. Not ending, not resolving, just continuing. I did not order extended tracking beyond that point because I already knew what the data would show, not because it was predictable in the way we once defined prediction, but because we had finally aligned our expectations with the reality of the system we were observing. I stepped back from the console slowly, taking in the room, the equipment, the team that had witnessed this shift alongside me, and I understood that what we had experienced here would not be remembered as a single case. It would be remembered as a correction, a moment where an entire field adjusted its understanding to match a truth that had always been present. "Doctor," my assistant said, and there was a question in her tone even before she spoke it. "What do we call this moving forward?" And I considered that for a moment, not the classification that had already been defined, but the interpretation, the way we would communicate this. Understanding beyond technical language. I looked at the final data set again, at the pattern that no longer felt like an anomaly, at the continuity that had replaced our concept of limits. And I realized that the answer was simpler than anything we had been searching for. "We stopped calling it survival," I said, and the words felt definitive in a way nothing else had, because they removed the implication that there had ever been a risk of ending. The room was quiet after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the statement settled into place, aligning everything we had observed into a single coherent understanding. Survival implied an edge, a boundary, a moment where existence could be lost, but what we had witnessed was not a system approaching that boundary. It was a system that did not recognize it in the same way we did. I moved toward the central display one last time, bringing up the archived data, the classification, the updated protocols, and I understood that from this point forward, every human case would be approached differently, not with urgency driven by fear of failure, but with observation driven by the expectation of continuation. Archive complete, my assistant confirmed, and the system sealed the case, not as closed, but as foundational, a reference point for everything that would follow. I looked once more at the space where Ethan had been, at the platform that had held a patient we now understood had never truly been at risk, and I felt that final shift settle into place, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear. We had not saved a life today. We had corrected a misunderstanding, and in doing so, we had changed the way we defined the concept of limits itself. And as I turned away from the console, as the room returned to its normal rhythm under a new framework, I understood that the most important line in the entire report would not be the data, or the classification, or even the updated protocols. It would be the conclusion, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. The humans do not survive the way we thought they did. They continue, and everything else we believed was built on the assumption that they would eventually stop.